Hello everyone, I'm Sue Percy, the CEO of the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar where we will be discussing the question, are we doing enough on EDI in the public space as we are in the workplace? This webinar is celebrating National Inclusion Week, and that's been led by Inclusive Employers, who are a membership organisation dedicated to celebrating inclusion and taking action to create inclusive workplaces. The theme for this National Inclusion Week this year is Take Action, Make Impact. And it's a call to action for all in an organisation, from leaders to EDI professionals, teams and individuals. Take Action, Make Impact is a powerful message which aims to get organisations and individuals thinking about what actions they can take and what positive impacts these actions could and should have for marginalised colleagues and communities. CIHT is committed to EDI, and we have our own strategy called Shifting the Dial and an action plan to guide our work, and also an EDI panel who advise and constructively challenge the institution on our EDI journey. And I must also take the opportunity to thank our EDI manager Emma Carruthers for organising this event. I am delighted to be joined for this webinar by Martin Tugwell, Michael Barrett and Holly Cregan, who will talk about their own work on inclusion and EDI and why it is important. So let's start with our first presenter, and I'm delighted to welcome Martin Tugwell. Martin is Chief Executive of Transport for the North, which is England's first subnational transport body, giving the North a strong, unified and determined voice on transport investment to benefit the region. Martin is a chartered engineer and a fellow and past president of the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation. He's also a fellow of the ICE and a past chairman of the Transport Planning Society. Martin also sits on CIHT's EDI panel. So over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Sue, and it's an absolute delight to be able to join yourself and colleagues on this webinar on what I think is a really important subject. EDI, or perhaps as I would look at it, more social inclusion in the round, is absolutely central for me in terms of moving forward for the profession. If we think about the foundations of sustainable development, the economy, the environment, society, people, we've obviously had a lot of experience in the past about dealing with economic assessments. We're getting better at the environment. There's still more work to be done there. But for me, the social inclusion, the dimensions around equality and equity within our transport system are important and have been underplayed in the past. And at a time when we're talking about the need for change in the transport system, the great risk for me is those most vulnerable to being excluded by transport are at potentially at greater risk of being even further left behind. So, I often think about if I was a single parent on a minimum wage and on a 0 hours contract, and I was listening to the transport debate, what relevance to me is a debate about an EV vehicle that costs £45,000 when I'm in that situation? I am just about struggling to deal with my life on a day-to-day basis. I have ambition, but the transport problems are actually proving a challenge. So for me, we need to rediscover our focus about people and about our places in which those people live and work and play. We often look back at some of our heritage with fondness about how we design such fabulous spaces. And I often reflect that we did that without having to rely upon complicated modeling and algorithms that actually gave us the answer. We had people within our civic leadership, within our professional leadership, standing up and understanding the importance of people and place and helping them meet their ambitions. And I kind of came across this for myself when I first started off in the profession as a modeler. And I was dealing with a transport model. I built it. I looked at the data. I looked at maps, photographs. I thought I knew every aspect of this place like the back of my hand. And then I went and visited it. And my perceptions were, this is totally different. Seeing people, traffic, vehicles in place, seeing how they react to each other, seeing how they react to the environment, seeing how they react to the built environment, was way beyond and different from how an algorithm would look at it. And if you think about it a little bit more, we're not rational in our choices. What we choose to do when we go out may depend upon the weather, whether we're on our own, we're in company, whether we've got another job to do or another purpose. Our choices are not as rational as our wonderful, complicated algorithms might suggest. And we miss that humanity in some of the things we do, which is why it's even more important to have different voices, different perspectives being at the table, challenging us, shaping us, and more importantly, us listening to them and giving them the weight they should have. Because I think frankly, too often as a profession, we've kind of adopted this idea that we have these wonderful tools and techniques and we have this understanding, but we need to translate that into the real world. And that's an obligation for me that sits on every single member of the profession. So yes, we need to do more to get a more diverse perspective around the table. We need to get a more diverse professional group of people. But there's no excuse for every single one of us, whatever our background, having that attitude. We can have access to data and information about the diversity of our communities, about the changes and the difference of in socioeconomic groups, cultural groups. All of this information is there available to us. We need to be using it and we need to respect it because we need to be serving those communities. And I've heard stories about where local authorities have ignored this to some extent or forgotten this, organizing meetings of taxi drivers on a day which was convenient for them, but maybe not convenient for the group of taxi drivers because of their religious beliefs. These are simple mistakes to be made. We shouldn't be making them. Now, in terms of Transport for the North, we've been taking a really key look at transport-related social exclusion as part of our work to update our strategic transport plan. The work on transport-related social exclusion looked at an evidence review, a review of the current sort of state of play. It also involved discussions with stakeholders, but more importantly, it also had data, primary data and research, where we looked at things like the indices of deprivation, about access to transport resources within communities. We looked at access to healthcare, education, all of those things that are shaping and part of people's individual lives. And we looked at it at quite a fine level of detail. The research goes down to areas about sort of 1,500 people population. So it's a really fine look at it across the north. And I hope that people listening to this will be as shocked as we were when we identified that some 3.3 million people, over 20% of the population of the North, are living in areas at high risk of being excluded from society because either they don't have access to transport or they can't afford the access to transport. Over 20% of our existing population. And that's not to say that the rest of the population in the North has it all good, because there are large parts within other parts of the North where these challenges about having access to services, opportunities, health, education, those challenges exist because we haven't thought about the diversity of the communities we're serving. We haven't thought about what they can afford. We haven't thought about a whole range of factors. And those are embedded into our appraisal system. We don't give a consideration to the impact on low income families or people who are maybe looking as carers or disabled, a whole range of factors which serve to act as a bit of a catalyst for why we need to look after them. And the processes we've got reinforce that. The funding we have, the funding is siloed. It's focused about economic growth. It's focused about planning for new houses. And yet we have over 20% of our existing population being excluded from society or potentially excluded from society because of this. So we've got to do things differently. We've got to get this at the heart of it. We've also got to start thinking differently. So it's not just about the different processes and using the information. We've got to challenge the way we see transport, because the cost of providing some transport services actually sits within one department. The benefits may sit in other departments. In an aging population, where we want to maintain independence for longer because of the better quality of life, the lower health costs, the lower social care costs. It's a perfect example, as we have an aging population, where changing our focus and listening to different voices is absolutely fundamental if we're going to get the right balance and make the best use of the funding that we've got. In addition to the work we've done on the transport-related social exclusion, we've also established what we're calling Northern Transport Voices, 550 people recruited from across the North, specifically to represent the demographics of the North, but to make sure we hear the voice from those people who don't normally partake in this debate. And we've used those to help feedback on some of our work around strategic transport plan, around the rural issues, around the recent proposals to close ticket offices. We're using these voices, these unheard voices, if you like, much more to feed in and shape some of our thinking. So for me, this is a fundamental issue for the profession. It's one where we've paid not enough attention for too long. Yes, we need to get a more diverse profession, but absolutely every single one of us has an obligation as a professional to use the information available to us, to use the data, to understand the dynamics and the diversity of our communities, to respect how those needs differ between different groups and different societies and different communities, and make sure that we're designing proposals that address it. And all the time, making the case for breaking down the silos in the funding, because the way the funding is set up actually entrenches some of the behaviors that we need to change as a profession. So it's a challenging agenda, Sue, but I think CIHT, by providing a leadership as an institution, and I'm very proud to be part of the EDI panel, I think that's part of it, but we need the people within the profession to be leaders in their own right so that we can actually make some real change here.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Martin, for that very impassioned call to action and to make an impact, which is what we're all seeking to do. I'd just like to ask you a couple of questions, if I may, just following what you were talking about. I think for me, we've often talked about when we engage with our local communities, the populations that we serve, we talk about consultation, and we know that that has its limitations, very much so, because often it is those who feel comfortable and confident to respond to consultations that get their voice heard. So I'm really interested in understanding a little bit more of how you have sort of reached out to maybe communities that perhaps have not traditionally taken part or fed into Transport for the North's work, and how you went about that, and how confident you're actually getting to those excluded communities that you are very passionately talking about, wanting to make sure you know their needs and their aspirations. So perhaps you could just tell us a little bit more about that approach.
Well, I think one of the key things for me is having established this Northern Transport Voices, this panel of over 550 people, specifically chosen because they have that diversity and that reflect that the differences, if you like, across the region. And it's been a very positive reaction we've had. We kind of can go out with pieces of work to seek views, seek contributions, but equally we can run sort of snap sort of polls and sort of get sort of a bit of a sound check, if you like, from what the mood music is, which I think is really important, and making it quite interactive has been quite key there. But there's a couple of things for me that kind of also link to your question. One is we often go out with a solution. How often do we go out and actually engage a community and say, what's your thinking about the future for your place? If we go back a few years, there was a trend to try and use things like planning for real as a way of actually reaching out to the community to say, look, this is where we're starting from. This is where we try to need to get to. How do you want to see your community be shaped to move forward? And my recollection is that that was quite a positive experience. People felt that they understood that they could shape the world around them and they were being listened to. And then when you get a particular proposal coming forward in response to that, as part of that approach, suddenly you've got a different kind of conversation. The other thing for me in here, which kind of touches on the points you made, Sue, there's one about confidence here. And I think, again, this comes back for me to the challenge around funding. I've already talked about how our funding silos channels behaviors in terms of focusing investment on more housing, more economic growth, all of which is important. But I've got 20% of the population now excluded potentially because they haven't got access to transport. And that might not be the community that is going to be that wants to travel great distances. They want opportunities within their own community. And so again, for me, there's a challenge here about funding, about recognizing we need to be smarter at how we use the funding. We actually need to break silos down, maybe give more confidence to local authorities. The National Infrastructure Commission talked about the importance of giving clarity for funding, encouraging people to have 5-year funding settlements so that people can actually, when they engage with the community, they can say, well, we can afford this because we know what money we've got coming in the next 5 years. It's a real shift in mindset towards outcomes that are place-based, user-centered, and which reflect the available funds for us. That's the challenge for us as a profession. And we've got to be leading the charge for the change within the system, but in our behaviors with our communities, we've got a personal obligation to change our thinking and our approach.
Great, thank you for that. And I do, I think consultation, I completely agree with it, is not enough. It never is enough. And you have to get to those communities that don't normally have a voice. And I'd be really interested, as your Northern Voice sort of carries on, how that really shapes the things that you do going forward. So one last question before we move on is around, you talked about sort of confidence, and I think that's a really interesting point to make. And I was reflecting on, well, how do we embed that? Because within professionals, within our members, within CIHT members who are designing, maintaining, delivering for communities, because I think a lot of the things that we do are very much based on your point around modelling and so forth. And how do we build up their confidence to actually make that difference, to really be able to take on board that communities are very different, they're not homogeneous, and they have different needs? How do we build that confidence in the profession?
I think part of it is about having role models that can act as champions for what's, how this can be done. I mean, if I speak about my own personal experience, throughout my professional career, I've always been curious. I've always wanted to know why something's being done and what's, I'll go and talk to almost anybody, as people who've known me will testify. And I think that in maintaining that sense of curiosity and open-mindedness is absolutely important about how we can encourage that professional leadership and give confidence to our communities that actually we do know what we're talking about. I've had conversations in the past with people who are maybe from the London and the southeast area who would say, oh, well, why are you worried about a 50 pence or a pound increase on a bus fare? Well, go and talk to some of the communities in more rural parts of England, or those that have been needing regeneration. And that's the difference between having hot food on the table or not. Again, there's no excuse as to why professionals shouldn't understand what the conditions are, what it is that's happening in their communities, now, either from data or from being about going out and actually asking people and seeking their advice. It's open questions. It's understanding, what are we trying to achieve? Because the value of us as a profession is we've got immense skills, immense opportunities to demonstrate those skills and show how, given a problem, we can solve it. But the reason why funding change for me is so important is, if you tell me I haven't got a budget, just come up with a scheme and then go bid for the money, that's a very different approach to saying, I need to solve this problem. I've got X million pounds to solve it, and I need to achieve these outcomes. And I passionately believe that engineers, transport planners are so well equipped to be able to do that, but it requires a mind shift in ourselves, and it requires a system reform in terms of how we look at these things, how we appraise these, and the funding that's available.
Right, that's a good challenge to, I think, or challenges to now reflect on. And I'm going to hand over now to our next speaker to follow Martin. And I want to hand over now to Michael Barrett. Michael is works for Transport for London. He's a construction advisory and innovations manager. He's also a chartered engineer and fellow of CIHT. And Michael has over 30 years experience within the construction, haulage and security industries, and currently leads a team that helps constructors implement safe, accessible and efficient logistics interventions. So over to you, Michael.
That makes me sound so old when you say 30 years. But no, number one, thanks for the invite again to talk about what we do at TfL. I'd like to start with our bold statement, every journey matters. And if you're thinking about equality, diversity, inclusion, that it encompasses in what we're trying to promote, or what we are promoting, let me say. One of the things that I always find is we don't reflect on how we do things ourselves enough. And typical things like what we're doing today is doing a presentation. Somebody might say, as we can see from this slide, or as you can see, read from huge amount of text that can be excluding quite a lot of people, and the importance of that awareness. I probably won't want to get too much into doing full descriptions of the images because it will take too long, but it's something important that we need to consider. And I've got an image in front of us at the moment of a resident in Southwark. Her name's Monica. She's a power chair user. She's visually impaired. She's in the limelight of her life in late 80s, and it's how she gets impacted about what we do in the construction industry. And disability has two models that we try and promote. The medical model being you're disabled by your impairment, but it's the social model that's the important one. It's our attitudes towards people and the infrastructure that we design, or how do we adapt to. And being the temporary environment is probably one of the hardest I find, that we can change a culture of being considerate for that every journey matters promotion. You just flick to the next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is talk about, if we're going to be giving access to people, we've got to think about, again, what we've discussed already is, if you can't afford certain modes, is walking, cycling is one of the most accessible modes we can have, and public transport. But it's recognising within that demographic who we need to consider the most and who is the most vulnerable that might be impacted by what we do. I've got 4 typical images of the types of cyclists that we encounter that often are invisible to the community, especially the industry. Whether it's a hand cycle, whether you're using a side-by-side bike, which is becoming more prominent now. And this is for someone who might not have the motor skills to cycle on their own, but you're now giving them that opportunity to do so. Also, we're moving away from cars into cargo bikes, carrying our families, doing our shopping, running our businesses. And having signs like cyclists dismount and use footway, for a lot of people just is not, it's not an option. And then how do we promote that when it's already kind of embedded in construction methodology? If you go to the next one. And then if you're thinking about the word disability, the spectrum of disability is huge. 16.4 million people have long-term illness and disability in this country. 80% of that number have invisible disability. Are we considering that 20% of the population in what we do? And I've just got some examples here of Jane on the image on the top left, who can't get across the road in time because we haven't allocated enough signal time, green time, for it to get across. Colours, complex patterns, how we do text, different font sizes, different arrows. There's a lot of people that are neurodivergent that struggle with this. And typical placement, I've got some examples here of placement of a push button. So for somebody who is blind, they would not know which push button works. They would go to the one as per design with the tactile that leads them to. Potentially standing there pushing a button and waiting for how long? Until somebody else comes and says, that's not working, you're at the wrong one. It's little things like this that we're doing, and how we approach the advertising, the signage, that we need to get people to understand what our desires are for them to negotiate our transport system. Go to the next slide, please. Diversity is, as a confident male, going out at night time, I feel okay-ish, but for a lot of women that I talk to going out, especially on their own at night, it can be quite an intimidating environment. Construction, from the images shown here, we've darkened areas, we've caused recesses, we've reduced activity because some people have a fear of crime not to go out. And when you reduce activity, it might bring an alternative type of activity, which we don't want. And then fear of crime can cause people not to go out. And it's how do we change that culture, looking at the lighting, the comfort, the active environments that people feel more comfortable to walk around, removing recesses, keeping areas clean and tidy. You know, and I've mentioned here 1 in 4 disabled adults experience crime, and not just once. How many women experience crime? How many people that are gender diverse experience crime compared to non-disabled males? And it's bringing that equality, that equity to the table about how we design stuff. Go to the next slide, please. And just a bit of thought, a bit of consideration. I've got one little example here of a set of works. I'm not going to mention the road or the contractor. It's a nice traffic management drawing that shows pedestrians and cyclists on a diversion route through an area. It doesn't explain what the area is. For 3 weeks of night works. I got asked to have a look at this. The area that you and I diverting people through at night time is a council estate. And there's a section that I've circled in red dashed area. It was an alleyway that there was no light in. It was all overgrown trees. A lot of rubbish and litter that you're sending people through. And on top of that, I did a survey of the types of crime that have been reported in that area. And there's one little slidey that's got a circle with a 6 and a circle with a 5 in. They are violence and sexual offences in the last month. So we are sending people into an area where they could be at risk. Do we consider this in our design? You know, and if you haven't been trained in crime, I had a security background for 16 years. I have been to police college, I have studied this, but if you're not fully aware of it, how would you know to think about it? And with TfL, we have duties under Section 17 Crime Disorder Act, we've got duties under the Equality Act, we're also accredited to White Ribbon, and that's to consider ways to stop violence against women and girls. Bringing all this together, we're in a good place to do that and to share that. And what my role is to preach to the community, not the local community, this is the business construction community, get them to interact with the local community, because every local community is different. And then how do you move forward from that? And then the last slide I've got is as an approach of being more interactive and not relying on tech and on Google Images, is going out before you start works and meeting that community themselves. And the top left image is, again, it's Monica. I've got quite a few pictures of Monica in a lot of the work that I do. She comes out with me to introduce herself to her experiences to contractors and let them listen to what she has to go through. We don't just have people with visual impairments. You know, we'll have the picture on the lower side is adults with learning disabilities that come out, and they see things differently. You know, you might think, yes, that's the way you can go. This is this nice, easy signage, but some people might not even understand that, and it's making sure that they do. And what we find is that construction companies drop that, think about the individuals within the company. We all have warmth, we've all got feeling, we all have experience of ourselves, we'll have family members. It then stops us feeling the pressure. We've got to deliver on time within budget. Actually, my son has autism, my daughter's visually impaired, my friend uses a wheelchair. I didn't really think about this, but now I can bring that into how I approach my work. And then for your traffic management, you should be able to change what you do. And a lot of construction companies are slowly getting it now. TfL, our project teams, we do a lot of work with them, helping form that collaborative partnership, and then bringing local communities together with what we do. And a couple of examples here is we go out and show construction companies where they're causing the word disability, where they've designed in a barrier to access for somebody in that local area, and how we can make changes to it. I think I've got one more slide left, haven't I? No, the thank you bit. But yeah, it's, a lot of this is culture, reflection, awareness, and better planning. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Michael, and great to have some sort of practical experiences and visuals as well on that. Oh, there's a lot of issues that came through from your presentation, but I did want to ask you a little bit about. So you talked about it's gradually becoming sort of more construction sector becoming a little bit more aware of the issues around accessibility. So how do we accelerate that? Because I think we're all very committed to this agenda, but actually, how do we support our colleagues to have what Martin talks about, the confidence to be able to design and maintain things in a slightly different way, being much more sort of aware of different needs of society. So how do we go about that, Michael?
Well, it'd be good to start utilising CIHT's platform and other institutes to get that message out there. Being in an institute, you'll be expected to do professional development. That then becomes part of that education. Putting into practice, setting up policies. Policies are easy to set up. We've already got the legislation there to back it. And then it's pulling it together. I think we've all got a responsibility with what we do. But yeah, I find training is the slower method. You need that structure within your company, that policy in place, but also put it into your contracts. So when you tender for a contract, within that contract, let's say you are going to do construction, whether it's roadworks or a development, you have to consider the spectrum of that local community with your design.
Great, thank you. So sort of training skills, upskilling across the board, and that sort of much more awareness, and the power of use of procurement in a much smarter way, I think is some of the messages that you're giving, I think, which is really important. The other thing I was going to ask about is, obviously with accessibility, you've got people in the community who have very different needs, and perhaps some are visually impaired, for example. Some maybe have physical disability or challenges. So how do you marry the two together? Because often I've had a lot of pushback where if you do something for tactile pavement, it suits some parts of the community but not others. So how do we sort of bring those different needs together so it works for everybody, or is that not possible?
Tough one. There is some overlaps. So with tactile, it's a safety issue. So for somebody visually impaired, it's to ensure they don't venture into the road, is to stop them there. For many wheelchair users that I talk to, for like myself, who's got severe arthritis, walking on tactile can be quite painful. It's marrying up the two. So safety always comes first. It's down to designers to come up with something new, the new type of surface. That's something that's looking ahead. But that is like a permanent infrastructure that we have to work around. With temporary, the overlaps are having enough width for people to pass each other, making sure they've got good contrast. There's a nice, easy structure that you can set up for that, making sure the signage is simple and not overbearing. And then doing your homework. Who is likely to walk past your site or through your site? But yeah, it's difficult. You can't. The promotion that we've been doing from my team's perspective is designing for the 20%. I think Martin mentioned this earlier. If you design for the 20% of the community, this is that have a variety of impairments, the rest of the community should be okay.
Great. Okay, now that's a really good message, isn't it? Because I'm really keen that from this webinar, there's some sort of key nuggets that we can take forward through CIHT, through the profession as well. And the other thing that you mentioned, I think this is a real interest and has had a lot of publicity, over recent years, is the safety aspect of, and we want more people to use our public transport networks. And this has been talked about for a long time. Some of it's around perception, and that can be because of the design of our transport systems and our interchanges, and some of it is real. And how do we sort of get that awareness more around when you're thinking it might not just be a gender matter, it could be for anybody. Anyone can feel quite vulnerable when they're using public transport, or when they're, I don't know, parking somewhere and it's very gloomy, etc. How do we raise that as well as a key issue?
Tough one. There's a tough one. There's different forms of public transport have different needs and different setups. There are a lot of schemes that the police have set up, a lot of initiatives like safer stations, like what we do with White Ribbon. It's getting people to join up to this, to share and be more of an active bystander outside with what we do. Have, like what Martin talked about earlier, we do something called the 3-tier assessment. The 3-tier assessment is tier 1 to get to know that local community. Tier 2 is putting that feeling into design, and then tier 3 is going out and testing it. And when you're talking about safety, we will be walking through it with local communities to understand their needs and demands. We'll cycle through it to get their needs and demands. And when it's out, well, during the design section, we'll be helping the designers to reminding them to consider what we found out in the first tier. And then tier 3 is testing to see if it's working. And with the same groups, and that helps raise confidence with how we approach work. And if that can be spread across, and it's not just London, I've been doing presentations outside up to Scotland, Transport Greater Manchester, Newcastle, so Martin, I'm sure we'll probably have a little catch up later. We've all got the same experiences.
Can I just add to, I was just building on what Michael was saying there. I mean, in the north, we've the Liverpool City region are recently introducing their new 777 local rail services, local train, and they've gone about it in the way I think that Michael's touching on. You know, they actually sat down with the community and said, how do you want these trains designed? What do you want to see on those trains? And one of the things that interestingly came out of that conversation was, why can't we see the pictures, the CCTV pictures in the trains, like you can on some buses? And to which the people buying the trains were saying, absolutely, we can do that. We can design it in. If that's the community saying, we will feel safer, we can see these images as you can on buses being shown on screens in the train, that will help us. That's exactly what Michael's talking about. Us as designers, as procurers, talking with our customers, listening and then reacting. And then you get a product where everybody goes, wow, this is what we're looking for. Brilliant.
Excellent. No, absolutely great points there. So thank you very much indeed, Michael. And I do now want us to move to Holly, who's our third speaker today. So Holly Cregan, and Holly is Head of Equality, Diversity and Fairness, Inclusion and Respect at Graham Construction. Holly began her career in the rail industry in 2004 and progressed into a commercial role as a quantity surveyor before moving into project management, a role delivering rail signalling projects. Now, Holly in 2016 was voted one of the 20 most inspirational women in rail by Women in Rail. And Holly has also led the successful achievement of the Investors in Diversity Award, the appointment of over 100 fairness, inclusion, respect ambassadors across the Graham Group. And Graham itself was judged as a top 50 company in the Most Inclusive Workplace 2022. So over to you, Holly.
Thank you. And thank you for explaining what FAIR was. I thought that was going to have to be part of my. So we follow the Fairness, Inclusion and Respect model, which is through the Supply Chain Sustainability School, CITB, SEEKA, and that's the model that we use. So we do say EDI, Equality, Diversity, Inclusion, but internally we follow the Fairness, Inclusion and Respect model. So I'm just going to talk a little bit as a contractor, really, what we're doing from an internal point of view, what we're doing with our own workforce to help drive, equity and inclusion so that we can better deliver the infrastructure projects that we work on. When we start with our people and internal, I think we're much better placed to then be able to deal with the communities, representative of communities, but also engage with the communities in which we work in if our people are competent as well. So I've mentioned there the fact that we've got specific FAIR action plans. As with most companies, we've got an EDI action plan, but it's not just that high level corporate policies and procedures training. It's about, well, okay, how does this translate to site? What do we need to do at site level to make sure that we're meeting our clients' objectives, the project objectives, the commitments we've made at tender stage, but also, how can they also complement what we're doing at group level, if you like. So some of the things at site level, we've got what we call a site pack. So first and foremost, we do check whether our own sites and audit our own sites are inclusive and accessible, because, it's like, sort of with health and safety, if you turn up to a site and it's a mess and that you can't get into the welfare, or there's boxes in the toilets, then, you know, it drives the behaviour, poor behaviours on site, because people don't treat it with respect. So, you know, we try and embed the whole fairness, inclusion, respect right at site level, so that our site is accessible, our site is inclusive, and then, you know, it drives the behaviours for our workforce, but also that's reflective of, you know, for the community that are passing our sites every day. So there's lots that sit behind those site-specific actions. Some of them are around that community engagement. So, you know, where are we working and what communities are we impacting? So when we do our annual campaigns, for example, we'll do something around disability awareness, we'll do something around neurodiversity, we'll be celebrating National Inclusion Week, and whatever those are, we make sure that we're doing something on site for those events as well. So raising awareness with our staff, maybe having an external speaker, maybe engaging with the local community, so that they know that we're taking these subjects seriously. In terms of governance then, so we've got a first steering group, but that is made up of our managing directors of all our different divisions, and also the CEO, so that, again, internally, people can see that there is that commitment and that there is that support from a leadership perspective. It's not, you know, an EDI group that consists of myself and a few passionate individuals. Actually, you know, our MDs recognise the benefit as well. So whenever we do want to roll something out that's new, we're able to pitch that to the steering group. So the MDs have bought into that. And that supports really the individuals moving on to sort of the FAIR champions, for example. People that are our FAIR champions, we've got over 100 now, and they're all trained and they're all at different jobs, different levels, you know, site-based, office-based across our group. And they are then able to see that if there's something that we need to take up to the steering group level, that the MDs have bought into that, they've approved that, and they know they have that support to carry out their role as FAIR champions, because, you know, the MDs are sitting on the FAIR steering group, which is where we will take things for approval to. I suppose one of the biggest things we do, and you've talked earlier about how do we, you know, ensure everybody's got that responsibility, is we collaborate and we share best practice. So we work with not just CIHT, but CIOB, Chartered Institute of Building, National Highways, massive client for us, and peer-to-peer. So we will ask National Highways, is anybody doing well on this particular area, because we're looking to improve, and they'll put us in touch with often some colleagues that we already know, and they say, yep, you know, this contractor are doing some really good stuff around this, go and look at their site, go and speak to them, let's put you in touch. And we do a lot of that. So we're happy to steal with pride in terms of ideas, but we also do a lot of sharing as well. If this has worked well for us, you might want to think about that for your project or for your site. So I think, you know, it's not a differentiator as a contract in terms of winning work. It shouldn't be. We should be sharing so that we can all improve, you know, as a sector, rather than using it as a contractual differentiator when we're applying for work. Next slide, please. So some of the ways that internally, as I say, that we're driving inclusion is we've got networks and we've got those champions. So we've got a really successful Women at Graham network. And the reason I wanted to focus on this, and some of my angles today are around gender, because that's where we've done a lot of our work. 2024 action plan sees us looking a lot more around the disability agenda and the race agenda. But in the 2 years that I've been at Graham, we've really focused on supporting our females and trying to retain that talent. So that Women at Graham network have been pivotal in driving some real change. You know, again, you've talked about, do we ask people, do we ask our communities? Well, we ask our people, what do we need to do differently and how can we improve? So some of the results that group's seen is that, yes, we had female PPE, but not everybody knew we had female fitting PPE. And when you went to the stores, was it there in your size and could you get access to it? So, you know, you've got the kits that means you're safe and you're delivering your project safely. We've also introduced free sanitary products, for example, in all our offices and sites. So when you go and visit one of our projects on the M2 Junction 5 or the A1, and there are the mobile welfare units down the roads, you can go into that toilet and there will be free sanitary products, which, you know, in terms of accessibility and being able to do your job, you know, that's massive. You shouldn't underestimate the impact of that for people and that feeling of belonging. And I think a lot of these things I'm talking about mean that when our people feel that sense of belonging and commitment to an organisation, they're then better advocates for our organisation and on our projects, and you know, want to do better for the areas that they work in. I mentioned Fur Champions already. We have over 100. They're key to helping to drive the inclusion agenda, you know, actually out on the projects. And again, you know, we use them, we ask them for their people's experience. What are your experiences, and how can we make that change on our projects because of, you know, what you've been able to tell us, and creating those safe spaces where we're able to ask, but also act on what they say, so that they see that, you know, they have an input. And you know, a big part of that is as well, I think you've touched on, the planners and the people that we have in those roles, helping them understand then, because some of them are Fur Champions, that it is your responsibility, rather than, you know, well, Fur's not part of my job, we've got a head of Fur. No, it is your responsibility, it is part of your job, and we weave it in through everything that we do, rather than it being a bolt on over here. So when I talked about that Fur side pack, for example, that's in our IMS, that's in our management system, and that asks people to do those checks at every sort of stage of the project. So it's part of Fur's part of that, rather than being something separate. And I also touched on those annual campaigns then. So when we do those events, you know, we do them at site level as well, so that we're helping raise awareness for our people, so that, you know, if they are working on a project that's having an impact on that community, they've got a lot more awareness because of the training that we're doing for them. So they will see things a little bit more because they're heightened because of the awareness that we're doing. Next slide, please. So this is just briefly just to give you a bit of an understanding about the impact of what we're doing has on our people. So, you know, really focusing on gender, really trying to retain people, put people, progress people into leadership, and have those role models, so that, you know, we're able to be representative of the communities that we work in, and what we do that's successful with our females, you know, ultimately we'll be able to roll out and replicate in other areas of underrepresentation in our sector. I won't go through all those. You can see some of those. Next slide, please. But it's not just about, you know, the metrics on paper. Again, it's about how people feel. So when we ask people in our surveys, whether that's investors in people, of which we're platinum, or Sue mentioned our national diversity, we've got investors in diversity accreditation. You know, this is what our people tell us as well. So again, you know, I think when we have people that want to work for our business and feel good, then they're going to be better advocates when we deliver in our communities. Next slide, please. So I think you mentioned earlier about, you know, training's not just enough. So we do make sure that everybody in our organisation has inclusive behaviours training, and all our leaders go on inclusive leadership training. So that's the MDs and their direct team. We've just recently had our MDs and our CEO go on allyship training. And I think that's, you know, really kind of the next step, is that if our leaders understand, not just from a project KPI or a client, you know, contractual reason, they understand why it's important, then it helps, it really helps drive that agenda for us. I've put on there about equality impact assessment training. Now, this is something new for us, because when you're talking about the projects and the design and have we engaged with the community, often for us as a tier one contractor, that responsibility is our design partners, and they would have done that exercise for us. And what we're saying is that that's not good enough for us to just say, well, the designers do that for us, and we can't influence that. So one of the big things we're doing in 2024 is looking at equality impact assessment training, showing people how we do them, how they're done, what they mean, why they're important. And we're doing that in a couple of ways. So one is around our own policies and procedures. So does this policy, could it negatively or positively impact a protected characteristic? But then also our site teams, so that they can understand what inequality impact is. So could this project negatively or positively impact, and what can we do about it? And that'll be particularly important when you were talking about the temporary solutions that we put in while we're building the long-term solution. So we really want to focus on that. And then building on the training that we're doing, we want that training to be specific to role. So when we talk about our stakeholder engagement teams, our comms teams, our planning teams, for example, we would expect them to have some inclusive communications training, and our designers, inclusive design training, temporary works designers, that sort of thing. So again, a 2024 aspiration that you're building up that awareness and you're getting something that is specific to your role to help you deliver that. Next slide, please. And then just recognition that we're always wanting to improve. We're always striving to to learn. Some really interesting stuff we've heard on this webinar already today, and it's given me some ideas. But we're working with the National Centre for Diversity. We have achieved Investors in Diversity, but we're not just resting on our laurels there, and we're working towards Leaders in Diversity. Leaders in Diversity sees you doing a lot more with your supply chain, so that'll be really good next step for us about how we do engage with our supply chain, how we have those more diverse SMEs and social enterprise engagements, and disability confident employer as well, making sure that, as I say, as we move into 2024 and disability becomes really one of our priority areas, that we're doing everything we can to be good for our employees. And as I said, that will then help us be better contractors for the communities we work in. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Holly, and some brilliant examples of the work that you're doing and embedding into Graham Construction. There's a couple of things I just wanted to ask you about, and then I'm just going to go back to all three of you, and I'll give you a heads up because I'm going to then ask you, as we close the webinar, sort of what is your final message or your call to action, given that we are talking about take action, make impact. So I'm just giving you a sort of few minutes to gather your thoughts on that. But back to you, Holly. I'm really interested. There's some brilliant work that goes across and in the highways and transport sector, and one of the things that I think I suppose worry about is that when I hear about this good practice, it tends to be coming from those who are larger organisations who have a team around them to support this work and have the expertise. So, and you touched upon it very briefly about the sort of how you're going to work with the supply chain, and of course tiers 2 and 3 might be very small and can be, maybe only 10 or even one person doing it. How do you take the things that you're doing, and how can SMEs sort of embed that into what they're doing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, because cost shouldn't be a barrier to SMEs, and often SMEs can be a lot more agile than some of the big contractors that's like trying to turn around a great big ship. They can put things in, and they're actually sometimes when you work with them doing a lot more things than they realize. So if you ask them about monitoring, they might say, oh, that's not something they do, but they do gather that information when an employee joins, so they are doing it. They're maybe just not recognizing it as being badged in a certain way. And I think, there are lots of free resources out there. So we've just done a couple of supply chain engagement days with our SMEs and supply chain, and we were able to share with them the fact that they can be members of the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and there is a free tool that they can use. It's like an EDI growth matrix, maturity matrix, and it's free to use, and it'll allow you to benchmark yourself and see what are we already doing and where are the gaps, and then set yourself a bit of an action plan. So we always engage with our supply chain by saying we'll help you do that, and we can talk you through what we're doing and what might work for you, and you can almost sort of pick the elements that you think might work for you and try and do those few things and do them well. But lots of free resources out there, rather than feeling like you've got to spend a big chunk of money with an external accreditor. You can use these free tools that are out there, but also asking your contractors, the companies that you work for, if you can meet with their team and talk about it. We also ask some of ours if they want members of their project teams to be fair champions, and we'll put them through the training, through our contact. So there's lots to do, and lots to learn. We can learn a lot from SMEs as well. So it's a two-way engagement, in my opinion.
Right, thank you for that, because I think that's always important to that how we embed this changing culture throughout the whole of the supply chain, not just in certain companies, because otherwise it's sort of sustainability and impact will be less. One final question is really about, we often get told that highways and transportation has an image problem in terms of recruiting people into the workforce. And I'm wondering sort of how you think we can really sort of bust that and really get more people from much more of diverse communities coming in to be in the workforce that can see things in a different way, that sort of that diversity of thought, so that we actually can always design in a way that is more representative. And I'm wondering if you've done any work around sort of that side of recruitment, rather than what I've heard you say is actually once you've got your workforce, how you work with them. But how do we actually change that composition of that workforce in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we don't have actually a massive issue in terms of attracting. And if I take females as an example, yes, I've talked about that focus on retention, but because we don't have a particular issue with the attraction piece, we use a lot of our female engineers as our role models, and we use imagery of our teams and our people in our job adverts as well. These are real people out there, like I say, on the A1 or the M2, doing their surveying. And we use them in a lot of external, media that we put out there. But yeah, the job adverts, and then the flexibility in the job adverts, so not limiting. We've done a lot around kind of anonymous CVs and blind CVs. But in terms of the attraction piece, yeah, you're trying to bust the myth, aren't you, to even get people to that point before you even start looking at how you recruit. How you interview and shortlist, for example. So yeah, job adverts, job language, and the imagery, and just putting your job adverts out in different places as well. And I used to work in the railway, and I would go into schools and talk about my role in my full orange, and we'd have some teams going in and talking about, it's coming up to the summer holidays, don't play on the railway, it's dangerous. And then there's me then going in, and another time going, join the railway, it's really great, it's a really great career. And it's, hang on a minute, you told me it was dangerous a minute ago. So there is a perception. So it's about sharing the different roles as well. So it's not just that perception of it's dirty, it's dangerous, it's there are so many different jobs that you can do in our sector as well. So we do a lot of work around promoting that. So when we are working in these communities, we will go into the schools, we'll go into the community groups, and we'll talk about the roles and try and challenge those stereotypes.
Brilliant, great, thank you, thanks very much for that indeed. We need to wrap up now, but I am going to throw the challenge back to the three of you. Is what's your call to action, or what's your final message around the Take Action, Make Impact in National Inclusion Week? So I'm going to go in the order that we started with. So Martin.
I think the thing for me, Sue, is to get across, this is absolutely everybody's priority, and in some ways we have a bit of a dichotomy here, because we know we need to do things better, we know we have a problem, and therefore we have to have things like EDI strategies and fairness, but actually what we're saying is it's an admission that we've failed at the moment as a profession to embed these at the core of what being a professional means. So we've got to get it across to people. Everybody in the profession has a role in looking at EDI. Everybody has a role in thinking about social inclusion. Everybody has a role to question themselves. What are you trying to achieve? What do we need to do in this particular occasion? How do we respect the roles and the needs of the community we're working within? and just be open-minded and keep that open-mindedness in all we do moving forward. That for me has to be at the heart of professionalism moving forward. And I hope we get to a point sooner rather than later. We don't have to have separate strategies. It is absolutely at the heart of what we do.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And Michael?
I mentioned that number 20% earlier. I've got statistics to back it, so it's not just a number we're throwing out there. So scope's always a good one to follow. There's some road safety associations have found that 20% of collisions are from stress. And from the police, I've had 20% of crime at construction is violence and sexual, which is all of it has got an impact on our lives. So a simple term is design for the 20%. I'm going to keep it simple, and if anybody they can embrace that, they can use that. There's a lot of stuff out there that can help people do that, and we're here to help as well. But yeah, in simple terms, design for the 20%.
Great, thank you, Michael. That's a very strong message. So thank you for that. And Holly?
Yeah, I suppose I would just say the next time you're, whether it's crossing a road or going to use a cash machine, that sort of thing, put yourself in somebody else's shoes and try and see it from a different perspective. It wasn't until my father ended up in a wheelchair a few years ago that trying to get him across a zebra crossing and over to Tesco's, and when we got to the cash machine and I realized it was too high, I just never seen the world from that viewpoint before. So just next time you're walking around, just try and see the world from a different viewpoint and think about what impact, what change you can make.
Brilliant, thank you. Some really sort of great takeaways from that, so that is brilliant. And I know Emma, I think we've got a slide which has got an address on your email address, because if there are those of you listening to the webinar and you've got particular questions that you would like to put to our speakers, please do take the opportunity and email Emma Carruthers at ciht.org.uk, and we will share those and get back to you. So you do have an opportunity if there's something burning that you would like to ask our speakers. But all it is now for me to say is a huge thank you to Martin, Michael and Holly. What you've said today and what you've shared with us and what you've also called on the profession to do has been, informative, inspiring, energizing and motivating. And that's how I feel about it. I can only imagine what others are feeling as well. And I'd really like to sincerely thank you for your time on this, because it is such an important agenda. And also to thank Emma for all the organisation around this. These things don't happen without someone getting this all together in the right place at the right time. And to also thank those of you who are watching this webinar, and please do get in touch, come on board with us, help us support this agenda, because the more of us who are backing this and behind this and living this, the more progress we will make. So thank you all very much indeed, and bye. Bye everyone. Hopefully, Emma,